Hey everybody, welcome back. Here's another quick view of world history for the AP class. Today we're going to be looking at the Cold War, which is basically the conflict of East versus West that really dominated world history for basically almost the entire second half of the 20th century. So we'll focus on kind of the background causes, a couple of the main arenas of the Cold War, and then kind of the end of the Cold War. So not very detailed, not very specific, but just to give you a general overview of what happened. So the Cold War, the main players are between the United States and the Soviet Union, although other nations did participate in one way or another, and the Cold War definitely had had things that took place in other regions. So it wasn't just things that happened in or on the soil of either the US or the Soviet Union. There's a lot more involved than just that, but we'll just cover the basics. So to contextualize, what's really important to think about is what happens at the end of World War II with the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union. So there's a shift that takes place in the global balance of power, primarily due to World War II. And it has a lot to do with the destruction of Europe, which from basically the mid 1700s until the end of or maybe even the early part of the 20th century, really dominated much of the world with imperialism and whatnot. And so you have the rise of the US as a global power, militarily, economically, and then also the Soviet Union, which kind of becomes the de facto leader of kind of the East, Europe, Asia, etc., because of the end of World War II. So that's something that's going on as we go into the Cold War. You also have a general collapse of imperialism, and so it's kind of keyed in here again on Europe being weak following World War II. Because of recovery efforts, the damage to infrastructure, economy, and stuff like that. It gets really difficult for a lot of these European states to maintain their colonial holdings, as well as there's a strong anti-imperialist sentiment among the colonized nations. And that goes back to the fact that for now 2 world wars, a lot of colonial peoples had participated in fairly significant ways to the war efforts of World War I and World War II, and really got nothing out of it, out of either case. And so at the end of World War II, the sentiment is, well, look, we fought for freedom in 2 wars. It's about time we got some of that for ourselves. So that's another aspect of understanding the Cold War. And then obviously one of the really big aspects is the onset of nuclear power and the threat of the use of nuclear power. So the US drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan, the only bombs to be used in warfare. And that really signals a new era of technological advancement and the ability for basically the entire human race to be destroyed if these weapons were used at a much larger degree. And then the next thing, a lot of the traditional powers had differing post-war aims, and that's really what we're going to key in on the next slide. Before we get to that, a couple things I want to go over here. It's the Cold War that gives us this divide, or this way to think about the world as divided between a first world, a second world, and a third world. So generally, you can draw a line across the hemispheres, and in both a vertical and a horizontal line. And I know it's not perfect, but it gives you an idea. You have this kind of blue area to the left, and then obviously Australia down here in the corner, which make up what's called the first world. And then that's the democratic, capitalistic, free world, as we say. And then in the top right side, where the red is up here, you have the second world. And this is in reference to the communist world, and so you kind of can see that China is included in that as well. And then this green area is what we refer to as the third world. And it's now called the global south, or the developing or underdeveloped world. There's different names for it now, but we used to call that the third world. And it's the third world where a lot of the conflicts are going to take place during the Cold War, because of the attempt to try to influence different parts of the world during the Cold War for either the democratic capitalist world or the communist world. And so when we use the term first world, second world, third world, it's really an old way to describe the division of the world between the free world, the communist world, and everybody else. So that's important to remember. The origins of the Cold War, we were talking about kind of the post-war situation after World War II. And a lot of it is rooted in the priorities and the expectations following the end of World War II. And so we have two major conferences that are going to take place, and how they happen and the things that take place during these conferences are really important. So during the war still, when both the European and Asian wars are still happening, basically the big three leaders of the U.S., the British, and the Soviet Union met at Yalta, and this was in February 1945. And the purpose was to start thinking about what the world after the war would look like, because by February 1945, the war on both fronts had really turned in favor of the Allies. I think they viewed it as only a matter of time before they would finally win the war. So a couple of things that they did: they agreed to a division of Germany. So they used occupation zones, and this map down here is a little image of what that design was to look like following World War II. So part of this had to do with making sure that Germany would not fully collapse in the same way that things got so bad after the First World War, as well as to agree to balance of power between the major powers that were left over. So there are a lot of reasons why Germany was divided, but those are just a few of them. One of the other points of the Yalta Conference was that Stalin agreed to free elections in Europe, and these are going to be the Eastern European nations where the Nazis had originally invaded during Operation Barbarossa, as well as their occupations of the Balkan states and Southeast Europe. He agreed that he would allow free elections. So this was a really big point of contention at the time. And then just a few months later, in July, they had another conference at Potsdam, and this is following the end of the war in Germany or in Europe, but the Asian War was still happening at the time. And a lot of things were different in this war. So FDR had passed away in April of that year, and then Churchill, who was originally going to be a participant in this conference, was ousted as a result of the victory of the Labour Party in 1945 parliamentary elections. So Churchill was gone. And so at Potsdam, it's a completely different diplomatic situation. And at the time, by the time July came around, the Soviets were in full occupation of Eastern Europe because of how they swept across and defeated the Nazis in 1945. And this is what Churchill is going to refer to as the Iron Curtain, because what has basically happened is Eastern Europe is basically relinquished to Soviet control, and Churchill will very famously say that an Iron Curtain has descended upon Eastern Europe, and that Iron Curtain is going to eventually signify the divide between the East and the West, and I'll show you a little bit more of that in a second. If we just look at this image right here, you have this red line on this map right here. That red line is denoting this supposed Iron Curtain, which divides the Soviet influence from the rest of Europe. The policy and alliances that took place will focus specifically on American foreign policy, because this is going to be another reason for the U.S. approaching the Cold War as they do. So starting in 1947, Truman gives a speech that eventually becomes referred to as the Truman Doctrine in 1947, and this stems from a situation where they were trying to provide financial aid to Turkey and Greece. It becomes the policy of the United States to assist and defend what Truman calls free peoples. And this really becomes a catch-all policy-wise as it relates to how the U.S. approaches its foreign policy going forward, which is to prevent communism. Not just to stabilize, to provide stability, but especially to prevent communism. So when Truman said it was to defend free peoples, what that inherently suggested was that it was to prevent nations from falling to communist influence. And so when the Marshall Plan gets passed, and again, the Marshall Plan was, again, that policy to provide $12 billion for the aid that would help rebuild Europe. And so all of those things were part of, or extensions of, the Truman Doctrine. And it really becomes the American policy throughout the whole Cold War was to try to prevent the spread of communism and to prevent nations from becoming unstable and having communist revolutions take place, which is what basically the West had seen happen in the first half of the 20th century in Russia and in China. Two alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. These were alliances that were created. NATO, it stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this involved the United States as well as the major powers of Western Europe, among others. And then the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet Union and its satellite nations. And these alliances were intended for collective security. It was a way to try to provide kind of a buffer against conflict. We call them defensive military alliances. These are kind of NATO still exists to this day, but the Warsaw Pact does not. But anyway, these are kind of the main alliances that exist during the Cold War. Some of the different arenas of the Cold War. We have the nuclear proliferation, or as we like to call it, the arms race. And a good thought to remember here is this idea of mutually assured destruction. Both the U.S. and the Soviets will conduct this arms race where they're developing nukes. The Soviets developed theirs by 1949. The reason I bring up mutually assured destruction is because of this idea of trying to avoid direct military conflict, because any sort of military conflict that might take place between the U.S. and the Soviet Union would inevitably involve the use of nuclear warheads, which would result in the destruction of both states and probably the whole world, which is a big sticking point during the Cold War, and something that's a constant fear among people in both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which was in 1962, was the closest point to actually conducting nuclear war. Had to do with the U.S. discovering missile sites in Cuba and some secret agreements that took place. It was a 13-day period in October of 1962 during the Kennedy administration. Other arenas, some things that we call hot wars, the conflicts that were waged for influence in the Third World. So when we think about the Korean War and the Vietnam War that took place, the U.S. was fully involved in both. Those are both both major hot wars, which the purpose was to try to stop the spread of communism. And in both cases, the U.S. Really didn't win anything. In Korea, everything remained a stalemate and kind of just stayed as it was at the end of World War II. While in Vietnam, it was a pretty big failure overall, and and Vietnam did ultimately fall and become a communist state. Um, the U.S. also intervened in Latin America. There's a number of different examples of this. And then a really notable Soviet conflict was the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which is really interesting because it's the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan which leads to the rise of what's called the Mujahideen. And out of the Mujahideen will come the Taliban, which, if you don't know about the Taliban, then learning about the Taliban will help you to understand a little bit more of the last 20 to 25 years of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as things like 9/11 and stuff like that. So these are a couple of arenas of the Cold War. A couple other things, the Germany conflict. I showed you the map of Germany earlier, the division of Germany. A couple of things took place. There was a blockade in Berlin in 1948, which led to something called the Berlin Airlift. It was just a really cool time, or really, well, it's a really cool event where for about 11 months or so, the U.S. and the British flew supplies into West Berlin because it had been completely cut off from the rest of the world by the Soviets, eventually forcing Stalin to lift the blockade. And then you have the creation of the Berlin Wall starting in 1961. And there's a lot of really good documentaries about the Berlin Wall. You can check some out on YouTube. That really becomes the symbolic dividing line politically and ideologically between the U.S. and the Soviets. Those are some things that took place in Germany. But the Cold War also was fought culturally speaking. And so ideological differences showed up in a number of different areas. So we have sports. For example, even in hockey, there's this really cool story about the U.S. Olympic hockey team in 1980 beating the Soviet Union for the first time in 20 years. And that was a really important moment, culturally speaking. There's also the Cold War influence in movies. And even if you look over here, you've got Senator McCarthy, who is responsible for a lot of for what we call McCarthyism, which were basically communist witch hunts in Hollywood during the 1950s and 1960s, kind of during some of the Red Scare period. And then also culturally, the space race became a really important factor, trying to launch when the Russians launched Sputnik in the 50s. That was a really important moment for the Soviets, and it was an embarrassment for the United States, and it turned into a matter of national pride, trying to get satellites up into space, trying to get the first man into space and to land on the moon, which eventually did happen in 1969. And then kind of apart from the Cold War was this thing called the non-aligned movement. And these were of nations that were trying to remain neutral and separate from the Cold War conflict, because there were so many different arenas or places where the Cold War conflict was taking place through hot wars and conflicts or invasions or political or economic influence. There's a pretty significant effort by a pretty decent amount of nations to remain apart from that conflict. And so that's what we call the non-aligned movement. Now, later Cold War developments, we have a couple of things that went on. During the 70s, a period was called the détente, which was a reduction in hostilities and a de-escalation of the nuclear arms race. During the 1970s, there were various talks, including one called SALT. These are the Strategic Arms and Limitations talks. And those were important in reducing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. They didn't last for much longer than a few years, but that was an effort to de-escalate the conflict. During the 80s, the Reagan and Gorbachev era, that was a period of time where there was a re-escalation of military and defense spending, especially on the part of the U.S. Under Ronald Reagan, creating what was called the SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative. Just an example of programs and spending that took place again, re-escalating nuclear proliferation, and heating up the Cold War a little bit, although there was no armed conflict that took place as a result. And then the end of the Cold War really comes down to the fact that the communist world, by the time the 1980s comes along, had really weakened and begun falling apart. You have China kind of moving away from economic communism, the Soviet Union stagnating, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who is right here, we'll talk about him at a later time, trying some new policies which ended up backfiring. And so the communist world really falls apart, and the Soviet Union, being the poster child of the communist world, as soon as that kind of caved in and weakened, that really was the beginning of the end. So kind of the initial point was the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. There were a lot of ramifications for that. And then 1991, the Soviet Union had disintegrated entirely into 15 new states. And so that kind of brings an end to the Cold War, which again was from 1945 until 1991. Brings an end to the Soviet Union, which had been in existence since 1917. And so those are kind of the key points of the Cold War. See you guys next time.